The story of cannabis is not a tale of sudden discovery, but of slow companionship, a plant that has walked beside humanity for thousands upon thousands of years, quietly weaving itself into the fabric of daily life, sometimes as a tool, sometimes as a medicine, sometimes as a mystery. Imagine the earliest people, long before writing, long before kingdoms, long before even the idea of history itself, gathering around fires in the dark. They stripped the stalks of this plant into fibers, twisted them into ropes, and wove them into nets strong enough to catch fish or to hold together the frames of their shelters. They cracked open the seeds and found food rich in oil, something to chew on during long winters when the world outside was frozen and silent. At first, it was not about smoke or dreams, not about visions or rituals, but about survival, about the quiet usefulness of a plant that gave more than it took. Yet slowly over centuries, people began to notice that when the flowers of this plant were burned, the air filled with a strange fragrance, and the mind seemed to wander in softer directions, as if the smoke itself carried thoughts away like drifting clouds. In ancient China, around 2800 BCE, Emperor Shen Nan, remembered as the father of medicine, recorded cannabis in his great herbal book. He described it as a remedy for pain, for sleeplessness, for the restless spirit that could not find peace. It was not a forbidden thing then, but a trusted companion in the long struggle of human life. In India, the plant took on a sacred glow. It was mixed into milk and spices to create bhang, a drink offered to Shiva, a drink that carried both devotion and intoxication, a drink that blurred the line between prayer and dream. In Assyria, priests burned it as incense, letting the smoke rise like a bridge between earth and sky, carrying prayers upward into the unseen. The plant was never just one thing. It was rope and ritual, medicine and mystery, woven into the daily and the divine, a thread that tied sacred. As time moved forward, the plant traveled with people. Traders carried hemp seeds along the Silk Road, tucked into bags of grain, hidden in the folds of cloth, forgotten until they sprouted in new soils. Wherever people went, the plant followed, sprouting in new climates, adapting to new lands, becoming part of new cultures. By the Middle Ages, cannabis had spread across continents. In the Islamic world of the 13th and 14th centuries, hashish appeared, a concentrated form of the plant's resin. Some rulers banned it, fearing its effects, while others ignored it. But in the back alleys of Cairo and Baghdad, smoke drifted from clay pipes, curling into the night air. People laughed, told stories, and forgot their troubles for a while. The plant became a companion of both mystics and wanderers, a way to step outside the ordinary world, if only for a moment. In Europe, however, the plant was seen differently. Hemp was not mystical, but practical. Kings demanded vast fields of hemp to supply ropes and sails for their ships. Without hemp, the great voyages of discovery would not have been possible. The age of exploration, with its caravels and galleons, was bound together by hemp fibers. The plant that some smoked in secret gardens was the same plant that held together the ropes pulling entire empires across the seas. It was humble and powerful at once, hidden in taverns yet stretched across oceans. A plant that could be both invisible, brought contradictions. In the 19th century, Paris became home to hashish clubs where writers and artists gathered in candlelit rooms, chasing visions and inspiration. They believed the plant opened doors to imagination, that it allowed them to see the world in new colors, to hear music in new tones, to write words that seemed to come from somewhere beyond themselves. At the same time, in America, colonists had once grown hemp for rope and cloth, but by the 20th century, politics and prejudice turned the plant into a villain. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 criminalized it, and campaigns painted it as dangerous, tied to jazz clubs, immigrants, and moral decline. The smoke that once carried prayers now carried stigma. Posters warned of madness, of crime, of moral collapse, all blamed on a plant that had been with humanity for 10,000 years. The plant became a symbol of fear, of rebellion, of something outside the accepted order. Yet the story did not end there. By the late 20th century, whispers of change began. Doctors rediscovered cannabis as medicine, prescribing it for pain, for nausea, for sleeplessness, much as Shen Nung had done thousands of years earlier. Countries began to legalize it. first for medicine, then for recreation. The plant that had been sacred, then forbidden, became ordinary again, slipping back into. When someone lights a joint today, in the quiet of night, they are not just inhaling smoke, they are breathing in history. They are part of a story that stretches back to the first fires in the dark, to the priests of Assyria, to the sailors of Europe, to the poets of Paris. The smoke curls upward, just as it did in ancient temples and medieval gardens, carrying with it the weight of centuries. It is a story of rope and ritual, of medicine and music, of fear and freedom. It is a story that has never truly ended, only shifted shape, like smoke itself, curling, fading, and returning again. And as the story drifts on, it becomes less about the plant and more about the people who carried it, who used it, who feared it, who celebrated it. The plant is only a mirror, reflecting back the needs and dreams of those who hold it. In the end, the history of cannabis is the history of humanity itself. Practical, mystical, fearful, hopeful, always searching for something just beyond reach. And as you listen to this long, slow story, let the words drift like smoke, soft and endless, until they dissolve into silence and you drift into sleep, carried by the same quiet current that has carried this plant through the ages. The story of cannabis in the medieval and early modern world is not one of sudden revolutions, but of slow drifting smoke curling through markets, palaces and fields, always present yet rarely noticed in the grand chronicles of kings and wars. By the time the Middle Ages had settled across the world, the plant had already traveled far from its earliest homes. Traders along the Silk Road carried hemp seeds in their packs, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, and wherever they went, the plant followed, sprouting in new soils, adapting to new climates, becoming part of new cultures. In the Islamic world of the 13th and 14th centuries, hashish appeared, a concentrated resin that could be smoked or eaten, and it spread quietly through gardens, courtyards, and marketplaces. Some rulers condemned it, issuing decrees against its use, fearing that it dulled the mind or encouraged idleness, while others ignored it, allowing it to drift into the rhythms of daily life. In Cairo, in Baghdad, in Damascus, smoke rose from clay pipes, and people laughed, told stories, and forgot their troubles for a while. The plant became a companion of mystics and wanderers, a way to step outside the ordinary world, if only from the edges of reality. Meanwhile in Europe, the plant was seen through a different lens. Hemp was not mystical, but practical, demanded by kings and governments for ropes, sails, and cloth. Vast fields of hemp were cultivated not for smoke, but for strength. For without hemp, the ships of Europe could not sail, and without ships, the empires of Europe could not expand. The age of exploration, with its caravels and galleons, its voyages across oceans, its discoveries and conquests, was bound together by hemp fibers. The ropes that held the sails, the rigging that guided the ships, the canvas that caught the wind, all of it came from hemp. The plant that in one part of the world was smoked in secret gardens was in another part of the world, the backbone of empire, invisible yet essential. It was humble and powerful at once, hidden in taverns yet stretched across oceans, a plant that could be both ordinary and extraordinary. Shift in meaning. In some places, it was a sacred herb, burned in rituals or consumed in drinks that blurred the line between devotion and intoxication. In others, it was a tool of empire, harvested in great quantities, processed into ropes and sails, woven into the very fabric of exploration and conquest. And yet, even in Europe, where hemp was most often seen as a crop of utility, there were whispers of its other uses. Travelers returned from the East with stories of hashish, of smoke-filled gatherings, of laughter and visions, of a plant that could carry the mind into strange and distant places. These stories were exotic, sometimes feared, sometimes dismissed, but they lingered, like smoke. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the plant had become so deeply woven into the structures of daily life that it was almost invisible. Farmers grew it because they were required to, because governments demanded it, because ships needed it. Sailors handled ropes made of hemp without thinking of the fields where it grew. Merchants sold cloth woven from hemp fibers without considering the plant itself. And yet, in quiet corners, in hidden gatherings, people still smoked it, still consumed it. still found in it a way to soften the world. The plant lived two lives at once. One public, practical, and essential, the other private. Hemp arrived with colonists, carried across the Atlantic in the holds of ships that themselves depended on hemp ropes and sails. Colonists grew it for the same reasons Europeans had, to make rope, cloth, and paper. It was not yet a plant of rebellion or counterculture, but a crop like any other, part of the endless labor of survival in a new land. And yet, even there, whispers of its other uses followed. The plant could not be confined to one role, could not be reduced to rope or cloth alone. It carried with it the memory of incense in Assyrian temples, of bhang in Indian rituals, of hashish in Cairo gardens. Wherever it went, those memories traveled. Medieval and early modern centuries were not an age of dramatic change for cannabis, but an age of quiet persistence. The plant did not dominate headlines or shape the destinies of nations in obvious ways, but it was always there, in the background, holding together ships, clothing, boaties, feeding animals, and in secret softening minds. It was a plant that lived in the margins of history, rarely mentioned in chronicles of kings and battles, yet always present, always useful, always waiting. And as the centuries turned, as empires rose and fell, as ships crossed oceans and returned with treasures, the plant remained, humble and patient. And so when we think of cannabis in the medieval and early modern world, we should not imagine sudden revolutions or dramatic discoveries, but rather a slow, steady presence, a plant that was always there, sometimes sacred, sometimes practical, sometimes forbidden, sometimes ignored. It was a plant that tied together the ordinary and the extraordinary, the sacred and the profane, the practical and the mystical. It was a plant that carried with it the weight of centuries, the memory of rituals and ropes, of incense and sails, of laughter and labor. And as the smoke of those centuries drifts into the present, it reminds us that history is not always made of great events and dramatic moments, but often of quiet persistence, of things that endure, of plants that grow in fields and gardens, unnoticed yet essential, carrying with them the long, slow memory of humanity. The modern story of cannabis is not a tale of sudden invention, but of shifting perceptions, of a plant that has been praised, feared, banned, and rediscovered, always drifting like smoke through the corridors of human history. By the 19th century, the plant had already lived many lives, as rope and ritual, as medicine and mystery. But in Europe and America, it began to take on new meanings. In Paris, writers and artists gathered in candlelit rooms, forming what they called hashish clubs, where they consumed the resin of the plant in food and drink, believing it opened doors to imagination, that it allowed them to see the world in new colors, to hear music in new tones, to write words that seemed to come from somewhere beyond themselves. They described visions, laughter, and strange journeys of the mind. And though their gatherings were small, they left behind stories that spread across Europe, stories of a plant that could carry the mind into dreamlike states. At the same time, in America, hemp was still grown as a crop, used for rope, cloth, and paper, but slowly, whispers of its other uses began to circulate. Immigrants from Mexico brought with them traditions of smoking cannabis, and in the jazz clubs of New Orleans and Chicago, musicians passed joints between sets, finding in the smoke a rhythm that matched the music, a looseness that carried into their songs. And cannabis became entangled in politics and prejudice. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed in the United States, effectively criminalizing the plant. Campaigns painted it as dangerous, tied to crime, madness, and moral decline. Posters warned of young people driven insane, of communities destroyed, of chaos unleashed by a single puff of smoke. The plant that had once been sacred, that had once been medicine, that had once been rope and sail, was now cast as a villain. The smoke that had once carried prayers now carried stigma. For decades, cannabis was pushed into the shadows, its users criminalized, its presence denied. Yet even in those years of prohibition, the plant did not disappear. It lingered in hidden corners, in quiet gatherings, in whispered exchanges. Soldiers returning from wars carried memories of it. Students experimented with it. Musicians sang about it. By the 1960s and 1970s, Cannabis had become a symbol of rebellion, of counterculture, of a generation that sought to break free from the rigid structures of society. In parks and festivals, in dorm rooms and communes, smoke drifted upward, carrying with it not only the scent of the plant, but the spirit of resistance. It was tied to music, to protest, to a search for freedom. Governments responded with harsher laws, with campaigns of fear, with prisons filled by those caught with even small amounts. Yet the plant endured, as it always had, shifting shape. By the late 20th century, the story began to change again. Doctors and patients rediscovered cannabis as medicine, prescribing it for pain, for nausea, for sleeplessness, much as Shen Nung had done thousands of years earlier. Studies showed its usefulness, and slowly laws began to shift. First in small steps, then in larger ones. Countries and states began to legalize cannabis for medical use, and then for recreation. The plant that had been sacred, then forbidden, became ordinary once more, slipping back into daily life as if it had never left. Dispensaries opened, governments taxed it, entrepreneurs branded it, and what had once been hidden in shadows was now displayed in glass jars under bright lights. For an age, the plant carries with it the weight of its long history. When someone lights a joint today, in the quiet of night, they are not just inhaling smoke. They are breathing in a story that stretches back 10,000 years, to the first fires in the dark, to the priests of Assyria, to the sailors of Europe, to the poets of Paris, to the musicians of New Orleans. The smoke curls upward, just as it did in ancient temples and medieval gardens, carrying with it the memory of centuries. It is a story of rope and ritual, of medicine and music, of fear and freedom. It is a story that has never truly ended, only shifted shape. Like smoke itself, as the story drifts on, it becomes less about the plant and more about the people who carried it, who used it, who feared it, who celebrated it. The plant is only a mirror, reflecting back the needs and dreams of those who hold it. In the end, the history of cannabis is the history of humanity, itself practical, mystical, fearful, hopeful, always searching for something just beyond reach. And as you listen to this long, slow story, let the words drift like smoke, soft and endless, until they dissolve into silence and you drift into sleep, carried by the same quiet current that has carried this plant through the ages.